America's premier spaceport is gearing up for a wild Q4 finale this year. Why? Well, not only has SpaceX been making enormous progress at LC-39A's Starship facilities, but Blue Origin is gearing up for its next launch of New Glenn. And the race between Stoke and Relativity is in full force in terms of who is making it to orbit first with each of their brand new launch vehicles, Nova and Terran R. My name is Max Evans for NSF, and we'll be covering all of that and more coming up on this month's Space Coast Update.
Boogity, boogity, boogity.
As always, I won't be alone this time around, as I'll be joined by both Adrian and Ryan to bring you the latest news from Florida's Space Coast. But let's begin at SpaceX's Roberts Road facility, where the company has been quite busy in the last few weeks building brand new Starship tower modules. Work on these modules has been absolutely rapid, as on our last flyover, there had only been one nearing completion. However, this time around, they were wrapping up work on the 5th module of what will eventually become the 4th support tower in the Starship program. To put this into context, the time in between our last 2 flights was around 40 days. So in that time, on average, a new tower section was built roughly every 10 days. Additionally, work is already underway on Module 6, as 2 columns of this section were already staged nearby. At some point, teams will likely clear the area farther west to build up the remaining 3 modules, topping off the newest Starship launch tower. The Cape will have no shortage of Starship towers in the near future, and so because of this, there's been an ongoing discussion about whether this one would be used solely for catching boosters and ships, like the one proposed for LC-39A, or a launch tower for Space Launch Complex 37. Taking a look at the hardware already assembled, we may already have an answer for that. Each tower is made up of 9 modules, and based on the layouts we've seen in Starbase, modules 4 and 5 contain hardware and connections for the Ship Quick Disconnect Arm, or SQD. And sure enough, we can see all of that here exactly, indicating that this tower will likely be supporting launch operations at Space Launch Complex 37. Now, there could still be a chance that even catch towers will have a Ship Quick Disconnect Arm for offloading propellant after a successful ship recovery, but for now, there's really no way to know 100% for sure. While each Starship tower shares similar construction methods and structures, there have been small changes on each tower as SpaceX has learned through time and now experience how to use them operationally in combination with Starship's design evolution. These SQD arm connections were among those small changes. While towers at Starbase's Pad 1 and LC-39A have 3 arm connections, Starbase's Pad 2 and this new tower both have 4. It's been speculated that the extra 4th connection will be needed for Starship's Block 3 design. This is because, despite having a stretched booster, the booster itself will be sitting lower with the newest design of launch mount and flame trench, as opposed to the current setup at Pad 1. This effectively means that the Ship Quick Disconnect Arm needs to be mounted lower than perhaps we're used to. When it's eventually time to stretch the vehicles on Block 4, they can relocate the QD arm relatively easily. It'll be interesting to see if or when the towers at 39A and Starbase's Pad 1 will have those additions installed to support those future Starship variants. Despite all of this, they'll still need a pair of chopsticks and a carriage system to move them up and down the tower. We spotted those already on the last flyover, and this time, teams were already putting everything together west of the rolling tent. And speaking of said rolling tent, this is where SpaceX is currently building the launch mount for LC-39A's Starship facility. They interestingly decided to cover both the launch mount construction and the welding of the carriage system pieces under protective covers, though this was likely to protect working teams from the harsh Florida sun. However, when they built the previous set of chopsticks and carriage system in Starbase for Pad 2, they really didn't bother protecting them against the elements with a tent, and same for the launch mount. But it never hurts to have that extra bit of protection, which I'm sure those with boots on the ground greatly appreciated. Speaking from experience, the sun here is no joke. Moving back to the launch mount, its design features a water-cooled top deck with 4 manifolds, each feeding it from every direction, just like that of Pad 2 in Starbase. During our last flyover, we only spotted 3 of these 4 manifolds at the site, but now it appears that the 4th has already been delivered, and all are now awaiting installation right by the entrance to the tent. Inside, teams also continue with the modifications and outfitting of the Ship QD arm that will be used at 39A, as we mentioned earlier. Moving to the north, teams continue to make progress on the foundations for Florida's very own Gigabay. Since our last flight, a whole field of concrete has been poured for the foundation. But believe it or not, there's still a bit more left to be poured.
And a foundation, wow, a lot happens in a month.
It sure does.
it really can't be understated how massive this building is going to be. SpaceX also begun installing the 4 tower cranes that will aid in its construction. As we can see, these 4 tower cranes will be located in Gigabay's transfer aisles with 2 in each. As it stands, it looks like the 2 towers to the south of the facility will be painted white, while the 2 up north will be painted black. The assembly of these is just starting, and so there's a whole lot more hardware for them being staged at different locations within the northern expansion area. With the foundation work nearly completed, SpaceX began to stage hardware for the main structure of Gigabay, which we can see scattered all around the site. It is going to be really exciting once Gigabay starts going up. And just as a reminder, once it's complete, it'll be about half the size of the vehicle assembly building just down the road from it at the Kennedy Space Center. Actually, by the way, recall in our last episode how SpaceX created temporary parking spots pretty much everywhere at Roberts Road? Well, it seems like they're back at it again. At this point, I wouldn't be surprised if they built a multi-story parking garage like they have in Starbase to accommodate the huge and ever-growing workforce of people there. We still have to think about Star Factory 2.0, by the way. Now with that out of the way, I'll go ahead and throw it to Adrian with the recent developments from Blue Origin as the company prepares for New Glenn's second flight. Adrian?
At Blue Origin's exploration park, progress hasn't slowed down. In fact, it feels like the site is entering its next chapter, with hardware moving through checkout, new buildings taking shape, and even more expansions already on the horizon.
Hello, Cat.
One of the more eye-catching updates was the presence of New Glenn's second stage in the company's 2CAT facility. Getting upper stages hardware into testing marks another step forward for the program, and a reminder that New Glenn is steadily working through the pipeline of major vehicle milestones constantly. Now, this is of course not the stage for the next flight, which is already checked out and static fired. This is most likely a second stage for even Flight 4 or beyond. So quite interesting to see them speed it up. Just across the way, construction continues at full tilt. The metal forming facility is now almost fully enclosed, with its exterior looking close to complete. Not far from it, foundation work for the expansion of Blue's main production building is still ongoing, a clear indicator that the company is already planning for larger throughput. I mean, this factory is already quite large, and expanding it will of course not make it any smaller. At the same time, crews are drilling foundations for the hardware integration facility. This site will eventually become one of the last stops for New Glenn components before heading padside. So even though it's early days with the excavation and piles, its importance is hard to overstate to get a good cadence running. And it doesn't stop here. Site prep on the northwest corner of Exploration Park hints at yet another expansion to come, and Blue is also planning an off-site manufacturing facility, broadening their Cape footprint beyond the current campus. Here you can see the footprint of that expansion, and you can see that it is quite a large area in comparison to the TCAT building, which is not a small one either. Regarding the off-site manufacturing facility, it is described as light manufacturing facility, and it seems most likely this will be handling pre-production of some parts, which will be moved away from the campus or other sites. Taken together, these moves show a company not just building for the rocket it has today, but also the cadence it expects tomorrow. Because yes, it only launched New Glenn one time so far, but it really seems they used this first launch to test their production line, and now it's time to expand where needed. Over at the facility where the first Mk1s are under construction, Max caught sight of a transport container staged outside, and an unmistakable sign that hardware is in motion. And yes, this is the container we have seen in the past being used for Mk1 landers. Future Mk1 landers will eventually come out of Lunar Plant 1 here at the Cape, but it's already exciting to see the earliest pieces getting ready for their own journeys. And finally, between Exploration Park and Launch Complex 36, work hopefully soon will kick off on Project Alpha, a vertical refurbishment facility. And this makes total sense. Blue Origin, based on previous company plans, really wants to fly a small number of boosters over and over again. So having a dedicated refurbishment area is very important for them. All told, Exploration Park feels more like a growing industrial district than a single rocket campus. From here, the next natural step is to check on how things are shaping up at Launch Complex 36. At LC-36, things are starting to feel like the run-up to New Glen's second flight. Friendly reminder, the first flight of New Glenn was in January of this year, and at some point Blue hoped to launch in spring or summer. That of course has not happened yet, but maybe fall or winter are still doable for the company. One of the most visible signs was a set of fairing transport trailers parked at the doors of the hangar. With New Glen's massive 7-meter fairing being such a critical part of the rocket, spotting these trailers so close to the action suggests that fairing handling and movement tests are part of the current workflow. Out at the pad itself, we saw the transporter erector in action over the past few weeks, as the New Glenn simulator was once again being used to check out the hardware at the pad. This is of course not a real rocket, but more a rocket sim that makes sure you don't risk a real run during training. But it's still a nice thing to see action at the pad. So now the big question, where's stage 1 for flight 2? That is the one key component that still misses testing. But it seems like we are getting closer, and once that stage static fires, that is really all tests they need to be done before flight. After that, the full rocket will be integrated in the hangar, and then it's time to launch. And we even got some hints for that. Just recently we saw the New Glenn transporter moving past the NASA VAB, which the last time meant the rollout for static fire was just weeks away. On flight 1 it rolled on October 16, 2024, and we saw the move to NG1 to the pad on October 30. This time it was on September 21st, which means we would look at somewhere around October 5th for that rollout. Now on flight 1, this meant a launch 3 months after that rollout, but of course that was campaign 1, so hopefully we see the launch a bit earlier than January 2026. We would love to hear your take. Do you think we will see flight 2 this year, or will it slip until 2026? Let us know in the comments. Moving north to Launch Complex 14, Stoke Space Nova pad has taken another big leap forward. One big change since our last Space Coast update has been the installation of the flame diverter. This is the massive piece of infrastructure that channels the rocket exhaust safely away from the vehicle and the pad during liftoff. With it now in place, LC-14 is becoming a true launch site rather than just a construction zone. Even more striking, the 4 lightning protection towers have also grown noticeably taller, and with that extra height, the outlines of the catenary wire system that will form a protective cage around Nova are beginning to take shape. Add in the central umbilical tower still under construction, and the skyline here is really starting to match the renderings Stoke has shared. Meanwhile, the integration hangar has made it through a key milestone of its own. Most of the exterior panels are now in place, sealing off the building and giving crews the ability to work inside protected from the Florida weather. Right next to it, a new water tank has also been installed. This will likely support the pad's sound suppression and fire safety systems. At Stoke's facility in Washington State, the company has completed structural qualification for Nova's second stage, which, if you don't remember, it's meant to be reusable. With the progress taking place at the launch site, plus all the rocket hardware going through testing, Stoke is clearly pushing hard to bring Nova operational sooner rather than later. Another company making great progress at the Cape is Relativity Space and their Terran R rocket, which will be launching from Launch Complex 16. The giant integration hangar at LC-16 has grown even more distinctive since our last flyover. The main section where Terran R will be integrated in its transporter has one consistent height, but the rear portion rises up higher, possibly to house a payload processing facility similar to what SpaceX does at Slick 40. On the side of the hangar, there's a third, much lower section that appears to be designed for office space. Based on the visible structure, it even looks like it may accommodate 2 floors. The exterior is also advancing, with wall and roof panels now being installed, giving the building a more finished appearance. Closer to the pad itself, we noticed some sort of foundation work taking place right next to the flame trench. It's not entirely clear yet what will this support, but possibilities range from the site's larger water tower for sound suppression to lightning protection towers, just like we can see at Stoke's LC-14. Either way, it's clear more major infrastructure is about to rise here. Relativity also continues to highlight rocket progress in its latest monthly update. The company has finished all barrels for the first stage of the first flight of Terran R, has finished manufacturing of the first flight engine, it is performing structural testing of Terran R's thrust section, and has started testing of the Eon engine for Terran R's second stage. Stoke and Relativity appear to be really neck and neck with the pad progress and rocket readiness to launch. Both companies are actively qualifying rocket structures and propulsion. They are well halfway through their construction of their launch site and are aiming for a maiden launch in 2026. Which of these do you think will eventually launch first? I mean, on the one hand, Stoke's Nova rocket is smaller than Terran R, but it also is a lot more ambitious. On the other hand, Relativity is doing all of this after having been on the brink of bankruptcy. Either way, I'm sure it will be really exciting to finally see these two rockets fly from Florida.
Claiming that SpaceX has been busy since our last Space Coast update would be quite the understatement, especially if we take a look at all the ongoing action at the Starship launch pad at Launch Complex 39A. SpaceX has made a tremendous amount of progress over the last month or so on different fronts, such as the Starship flame trench. For example, several of the flame trench wall pieces that we had seen transported and staged at the pad have now been installed in the trench. As is now tradition, a lot more concrete has been poured in the flame trench as well, and SpaceX were continuing to pour concrete while we were in the air. Unfortunately, we can't fly directly over the trench as the airspace is restricted, but we're assuming that the A-frames that will hold the two halves of the flame bucket are also down in the trench and installed by now. Those two flame bucket halves still remain at the same location they had been delivered to, and they're still being worked on as evidenced by the makeshift tents that cover the work areas. If one were to guess, they're probably in the process of drilling all the holes from which the water will flow out of the bucket for the launch pad's deluge. In addition to this work over the last few weeks, teams have installed 3 of the legs that will support the launch mount structure once it is installed at LC-39A. We're not sure exactly when the launch mount will be ready, given that there's still a bit of work remaining, as Max outlined earlier. Another major addition to the pad has also been the assembly of the service structure that will sit next to the launch mount. This service structure will provide it with all the plumbing and power lines that connect to the ground systems. Right now, it's in the very early stages of construction, and just like we're seeing at Starbase, it's a really complex structure, so it'll take several months to be complete.
There's cranes everywhere out here at KSC and Cape.
In our previous Space Coast Update episode, we mentioned that there was a noticeable lack of a big crane at the site, but as you may have noticed, there is indeed a big crane at LC-39A. It's hard to miss. This is a Liebherr LR11000 crane, the same type that SpaceX has at the Starbase launch site. What's interesting though is that this crane in particular has already been in use by SpaceX before, and has also been in Florida before. When SpaceX started to seriously work on the Floridian Starship facilities back in 2022, the company bought this LR11000 crane with the intent to use it to build up what was, at the time, planned to be the Florida Megabay for Starship. But as may be obvious by now, plans changed and SpaceX scrapped the plans for a megabay in Florida and instead built a second one at Starbase. That second megabay was built with the same parts that were ordered for the Florida Megabay, and also using the exact same LR11000 crane that had been bought for Florida operations. Well, that crane is now back in Florida, and it is being used to aid in the construction of the Starship pad at 39A. However, that crane alone won't be enough to lift the heavy Starship launch mount when the time comes. At Starbase, SpaceX used 2 LR11000 cranes in tandem to lift the launch mount and install it over the flame trench. So either they'll need to bring in another one, or they'll need the much larger LR13000 crane, which is the most powerful conventional crawler crane in the world. Further up north, teams continue to populate the tank farm area with, well, more tanks. What did you expect? It is a tank farm after all. Since our last flight, SpaceX has installed 4 large cryogenic tanks and 2 smaller ones at the site where we believe the liquid oxygen storage tanks will go. It also seems like the area in between the storage tanks for methane and the storage tanks for oxygen will be used for the pumps and subcoolers for these 2 commodities. In this latest flyover, we can already see many of the support support structures that will be holding a lot of the pumps, valve assemblies, and other pieces of hardware once they're installed. On top of that, it appears that at least one of the subcoolers is already in place at the site. It also looks like work has begun with installing all the transfer lines from the propellant tank farm out to the launch mount and tower. A bit further south of the new liquid oxygen storage tanks is the water deluge system for the 39A Starship pad. While no more new tanks have been added since our last aerial visit, there is now visible progress on hooking the existing tanks to the pressure pipes that will force the water out of the tanks and to the different places at the launch mount and flame trench. If you thought that was a lot of tank farm hardware, there's more to come. There's even more hardware staged at the southwest of the main ramp, which will likely be installed as different parts of the tank farm are complete. By the way, you may notice that the Falcon Transporter Erector is not out on the ramp in our photos, and that is because during the flight, it was inside the horizontal integration facility to integrate the Falcon 9 for NASA's IMAP mission. That, of course, has since launched. At Space Launch Complex 37, SpaceX's other Starship launch complex in Florida, work continues with clearing out the area following the dismantling of the old Delta IV hardware. From the south, it almost looks like they're flattening the mound where all that hardware used to be, likely in preparation for the future launch and catch towers. If, as theorized, the tower sections being built at Roberts Road are for a launch tower, then we should see foundation work at Slick 37 really soon, so we'll keep a close eye on that. Something else we're keeping an eye on is the neighbouring Space Launch Complex 40, which has recently had some interesting developments. Last month, the FAA released the final environmental assessment for Falcon 9 operations at Slick 40. This assessment had looked at SpaceX's proposal to increase the maximum annual launch cadence at Slick 40 up to 120 launches per year, and also the construction and operation of a new landing pad within the complex. This was also accompanied by a mitigated finding of no significant impact, or FONSI, that is to say, the launch cadence increase and the construction of the new landing pad were approved from an environmental standpoint, provided that SpaceX carries out a few actions that would mitigate some of the environmental impacts from these operations. With the assessment complete, SpaceX wasted no time and has already begun clearing the area for the new landing zone where, not long from now, boosters will be landing during a return to launch site recovery. This is all because, by the end of the year, SpaceX will no longer be using Landing Zone 2 at the Cape, following the retirement of Landing Zone 1 a couple months ago. During this flyover, our team spotted booster B1094 laying horizontally right outside of the landing zone area after having been recovered on the NG-23 mission. Next to B1094, we can see a booster engine section sitting all alone, which we presume is most likely the remains of booster B1086, which was lost earlier this year in a post-landing fire on a drone ship. Oh, and speaking of booster spottings, while we were in the air, booster B1085 was near NASA's VAB, rolling out to Slick 40 to support the Starlink 1027 launch last Sunday. On the other side of the VAB is Mobile Launcher 2, which NASA is building for the Block 1B version of the Space Launch System. Yep, it's time to talk about Artemis. Since our last update, teams at Bechtel have installed the tail service mast umbilical on the main deck of the mobile launcher. This is one of the two umbilicals that will provide the commodities needed to fill up the SLS core stage. Further up the tower, it seems like they've installed the Orion service module umbilical, as well as the supports where the crew access arm will be installed. The Orion service module umbilical supplies liquid coolant for the spacecraft's electronics and air for the Orion environmental control system while it is on the ground. During this flyover, some of the VAB door panels were open, which allowed Max's long lens to peek through and see the SLS rocket that's currently inside the building. This SLS is the one that will fly on Artemis 2, the first crewed launch of SLS and Orion, and it's nearly ready to go. All major components of the rocket itself have been stacked and have completed validations and checkout testing inside the VAB. The only piece remaining in the puzzle is the Orion spacecraft itself, which will sit atop the big orange rocket. Over the last month, Orion has been in the Launch Abort System facility at the Kennedy Space Center receiving its Launch Abort System. That work is now nearly complete, with only final closeouts still pending. Near the end of August, NASA also delivered the Orion stage adapter to Kennedy to prepare it for stacking. This adapter will go on top of the ICPS, or the Interim Cryogenic Propulsion Stage, also known as the SLS upper stage, and will be housing 4 CubeSats that will be riding along for this flight. In a few days, this adapter should be making the trip to the VAB and will be installed on the ICPS ahead of Orion stacking in early October. This means that by the time of our next Space Coast update, we'll most likely have another SLS rocket fully stacked and nearly ready to go, ahead of Artemis 2 early next year.
We're going to stay up here all day.
Well folks, that's going to wrap up today's Space Coast update. We always say this place is the spaceport that never sleeps, and you can certainly see why. When do you think the long-awaited first flight of Starship from 39A will finally happen? And between Stoke and Relativity's rapid work, who's launching first between them? Let us know in the comments section down below. I'm Max Evans for NSF, and I'll see y'all next time.